All right. Good morning, everyone. This is Charissa here at Charm City Readers. I'm going to take that off. And I have John Maly here, who is the author of Juris Ex Machina. I pronounced it right that time, I hope, John.
You did, yes.
Thank you. I appreciate the 2
Like
points.
all the other times that were not recorded.
Right. Thank you. My name is Charissa, and I am the admin on Charm City Readers, which is a Baltimore-based book club on Facebook, so you can find us there. And John has written this exquisite new book that came out, I believe, June 5th. Does I have that date right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so I got to read it in July. I actually have an advanced copy, so like I'm kind of hoping that at some point I can ask you about maps. I desperately want a map in my version of the book. I don't know if you supplied one in the original.
There was one ultimately.
That's what
and
I
there
get.
were way fewer typos than the advanced version had.
I can look past those. I don't care.
There
Like
were like 120. Despite the dozens of people who had done editorial kind of revision suggestions, there were like over 100 typos and repeated words and things, which is stunning to me because this book has been, even by me, been reviewed through like 14 different versions over like 10 years and still.
Well, I'm in marketing and you don't even see it. Like, I'm not going to tell anybody where I work, although you could look it up, or which campaign it was. But we like published a campaign like with hardbound signs, and we realized we flipped 2 letters, and we're like, like, and it was like a very short campaign, and my boss sort of thought it was funny, but I was horrified, because that's our job, right? Our job is to get it right, and we're just human, and we are like fallible. So,
yeah, being human is overrated.
It is highly overrated. But I mean, do we really want to be AI? Because I guess we'll get into that.
Maybe there's some third option that we just haven't come upon.
No, I listened to so we haven't even gotten to the book yet. I listened to your podcast. What's the weird, wild? You did a podcast with it's something weird, wild things. Anyway. And you guys got into AI in a very scary way. And I'm like driving and like a bit horrified thinking that I'm in the Matrix and you guys are talking through all that. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to zone in and pinch myself and remind myself that I'm real.
Yeah. It's sort of interesting when especially because like there's lots of interesting implications, but I've been working in technology for like a couple decades and, before that going to school for it. And I would say that, all these things, anytime there's some new technological, like major achievement, it ends up, having societal implications and whatever. But the thing that's been fascinating about AI is that every like 2 or 3 months, there's all these like new implications that nobody had considered because they hadn't realized that, LLMs could be used in this other strange application. So it's a lot of work. I mean, I on my other job, I get paid to just keep abreast of technology. And with AI, it requires just sort of constant checking. Like you have to read the headlines every day because there's always something unexpected coming out of like left field. So I think that's why it's such an important societal issue, though, is that it's going to affect people in ways they can't even imagine. And it's sort of like a singularity. I mean, it's almost like the Industrial Revolution or, the invention of the internal combustion engine. Like everything from, the fact that we can fly between continents now and it's not this like, month-long steamship trip or whatever. Like, I think it's changing the world in a way that's similar to that and in ways that aren't necessarily intuitive. So that's been kind of fascinating for me as a technologist.
Well, I imagine given your day job that you must have just ideas for books all the time. Like, cases you can't talk about. So we're going too far to give everyone like the 30-second background about you, because I think that plays really interestingly into how this book came about.
Sure. So I originally went to college and to grad school for doing computer engineering, microprocessor design. And, a big part of that during school, my side major was psychology. So I did psychology and computers, and the sort of logical intersection of those things, or the overlap, was always AI. Mm-hmm. And even without kind of seeking out AI, there would be just sort of these ideas from one class you took, like, the kind of synthesizing with some other thing in the other like field of endeavor. So that was going on. And then when I was in grad school, I got to write some like, fairly hardcore AI programs that were game playing AIs that would play various board games and things against each other, and they would compete and they would learn from each other. And you would end up with these interesting things where there's this thing called overtraining, which is, I think the human equivalent would be like if the only time you ever play chess is like against your uncle. You might get really good at playing chess against your uncle, but then on the 200th game, when you go and play with like your neighbor, you're going to lose terribly because you're not used to all these like types of attacks. And you see that it's everything from like martial arts to AI, where if you train too much on a kind of narrow data set, you sort of lose visibility. But anyway, so I had studied AI, and then after being a computer engineer for several years, I ended up going back to school, going to law school. And I was reading this article from, I believe it was 1954 in the Stanford Law Review that we were assigned to read like freshman year or first year of law school. And it was talking about how every sort of cause of action or law could be broken down into a logical formula. And, it was very mathematical, and they laid it out on the page as and kind of step through examples. And, the first thing that occurred to me coming from literally just months before being a computer engineer is, wow, it would be really easy to implement these all in a program. And so the idea kind of planted itself then. And I recall spending a couple nights just staying up late, like typing up notes and ideas. But until I actually did the, much later, the Stanford Online Writing Certificate Program for novel writing, that's what sort of forced me to just spend 2 years just solidly working on it constantly. And that's when the concept really came together of what it would look like to have a justice system that was administered by artificial intelligence and replacing human jurors who, that's one thing we learned about a lot in psychology and forensic psychology, especially, is that there's so many fallacies that jurors typically fall prey to. Everything from, in a criminal case, the fact that if the defendant is brought in like leg irons in this orange suit and, sits down, you're going to automatically assume he's guilty. Like some part of your brain is going to be like, wow, that looks like a bad dude. He just like shuffled in here in chains. So things like that to, kind of like vivid imagery where the attorneys just kind of paint this really, vivid image of the people who have been aggrieved and how we just want to help them regardless of what really happens. Things like that just psychology studies have shown again and again that jurors just sort of fall for. So, AI can kind of eliminate that. So it was that was kind of interesting, right? So we know what the problems with what we'd be replacing are, but what would the benefits and especially the detriments be of the new thing? So that's kind of what inspired me to start just writing the book and exploring the space.
Out of curiosity, have you ever been on a jury yourself?
No, I've been in the courtroom so many times, but the thing with being a juror is that if you went to law school, like they just have no interest in you. And this is something I've discovered, and I think I can say this in a way that does not prejudice any of my clients in their cases, but I will say that working on patent cases that have to do with technology, usually the first thing that the whichever side has more of a bogus case will do is they'll take anyone who has any tech background, like the lady who's in charge of IT at her company, and they'll use one of their 3 strikes where they'll just pitch that one side can. The way that works is one side can just preemptively kind of like throw that juror out without any stated reason. And then there's other things where, like, if a juror obviously has a conflict, like they can be thrown out without using one of those. But they'll try to get the most technologically ignorant, whoever has the weaker case will try to get the most technology ignorant jury possible so that their expert witness can swoop in and sort of program them. And I think on the criminal side, which is usually what you're called for jury duty, is um, that's sort of the same thing if you went to law school. Like there's certain things they just don't want jurors to know about. They don't want jurors to know about jury nullification, which is a thing that's available in every American court, which is that if you think the person is guilty of whatever they're charged with, but you think the law is stupid and shouldn't be like used to send this person to prison, like if you think it was a victimless crime, or you think the person was like stealing to like, you know, feed their children, you can vote for, you can nullify. The jury can do this thing called nullification. And it's kind of like the secret superpower that juries have, but judges are so against it because it sort of usurps their power that just about any judge in the United States, they will not allow attorneys to explain to the jury that there's this option available to them.
Wow.
So that is a really interesting thing because it basically says if there's widespread support against some unpopular law, the jury can just choose not to enforce it and choose to basically say this is a stupid law. And that's absolutely something that judges don't want.
Judges don't want that, and that right there's a framework for that apparently, right? We hope.
So not only do attorneys not want you to be on the jury in a you know the prosecutor doesn't want you anywhere near a case if you can explain that to the other jurors, but on top of that, the judge probably is quite happy to toss you off. So I've been called for jury duty and never actually been selected as a juror.
I was a jury member years ago, and it was you know, small criminal case. I mean, it was like a day, maybe 2 days. And I still to this day, it's one of the most fascinating things I've ever done because it's exactly what you said, the human psychology. And I'm not going to get into it because this is about you, but what happened in the jury room while we had to walk through and the outside influences that were affecting certain people and then how we got past it, I will never forget that experience because it was huge. It was huge to me. It was just moving because everything you have to work through to get to a common ground at the end of it is a lot. And it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. And what's sort of interesting is that, you know, if you're exploring the idea of how can we use AI to carry some of that load so it's not as difficult for humans, the question is like, okay, well, how many of, you know, humanity's biases are going to be absorbed by this AI and applied? And it comes down to how you train it, right? We were talking about training and what you use your training sets. And the question is, are you looking for an AI that will have really high fidelity at reproducing what the average jury would come to as far as a conclusion? Are you going to try to go higher than that level? Are you going to maybe say, you know, here's 1,000 cases that the world's top legal ethicists have all agreed this case was decided correctly? And it's not typical cases. It's like weird corner cases where someone was like, you know, stealing to feed their family or something where, because the third option is you just have it enforce the law completely
blindly. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the case that's, you know, it's going to clash with legal ethicists for the person who's, you know, stealing fruit to feed their family. So that's an interesting question in itself as to how many, you know, how we choose to do this and how many biases we end up, you know, sort of like bad parenting, like you teach your kids to make the same mistakes in life that you did.
Right. Let's not get into parenting. That is a beast in itself. And I know we're both parents, so.
Ooh, yeah, if there was an AI for parenting, I would sign up on just day one because I can only do a better job than I do. So.
Okay, so let's talk about the book.
Everybody wants to be a writer, so that's how I know I've failed already at parenting.
No, really? You're not proud? That's exciting.
I feel like it's just going to be a hard life.
My son wants to be a YouTuber, so I think you're winning right now. Like we'll be playing like a video game and he's like narrating it. And I'm like, there's no one here. There's
oh, wow.
No one here. I mean, I guess it's good practice, right?
Yeah, I knew somebody who was a sportscaster, and you absolutely, you sort of call these games even if nobody's listening to.
Yeah, that is my 7-year-old. Okay, so Juris, because remember, I'm not going to mispronounce it this whole interview. Give the 30-second boilerplate. Like, you know, we've got a protagonist. He's 19. He's like a cool kid, and he gets into trouble. Give us like the little pitch. Right.
So the premise of this is we're in the 22nd century. So this is sci-fi, but it's not really hard sci-fi. It's more kind of speculative, like legal fiction. And the premise is that we are in a world where AIs have replaced juries. and do a better job. So they don't get things wrong as often, and they're nearly perfect. And we've got this 19-year-old who is a kind of a small-time hacker, scofflaw, shoplifts occasionally. And he gets falsely convicted of mass murder of hundreds of people. And he gets sent away to this really nasty prison that's got some bases and real prisons in the world, in Peru specifically. And he gets stuck there, and then his attorney's trying to figure out what happened, because as you can imagine, if AIs are the justice system, if you're an appellate attorney, a big part of your job is probably going to be kind of reviewing how these AIs work and where they could have gone wrong. So it's more of a system analysis role than, well, I shouldn't say that. I think if you're appealing to a state Supreme Court, it very much is sort of system analysis. You look at the records of the particular justices you're addressing, and you kind of see what kind of arguments they respond to. So it probably is very similar, but he essentially has to escape from this prison and reunite with his attorney, and they have to figure out what went wrong and try to clear his name while he's essentially a wanted person.
What I love about it, and I'm not sure how like intentional it was, or if that's even the right word, is that there are so many layers in the book. So you've got the main storyline, which is Rainville and like everything that's happening to him and his crisis and how he gets out of it and how he rises above it, right? And conclusion at the end. And then you've got the AI legal themes, right, that you've woven in, and it's heavy. Sometimes Fox, right, who is his attorney, is kind of carrying the load of the story because Rainville is off having a horrible experience somewhere else. So there's this AI and maybe some of your belief systems or things that you've noticed via your career weaving through there. And then there's like the layer of the actual city, which like I love world building. So I want a map and I want to know how we got there. And, they're climbing through tunnels and old subway stations. And that to me is like a character too, because of the descriptive nature.
Right.
And then you layer on the epigraphs, which blew my mind because they terrified me quite a bit. But the epigraphs, in each part or each chapter gave a tone to kind of how we got here. Like AI is new-ish, but we've been doing this human psychology thing that's affecting it for a millennia or however thousands of years. So, right. So like there are all these layers, and where I'd kind of like settle into the story and get into what was happening to Rainville, all of a sudden there's this like AI problem and a legal problem around it. And that doesn't make sense. And then they're climbing through a tunnel. And then we're talking about witch trials. And I'm like, geez, like there's, I don't want to say so much because it's great, but there's so much color like to the story. So one of my questions was like, which came first? Like, obviously you had Rainville and you had this story of something happening to him, but how do all the layers get added on? Like, did the epigraphs come at the end? Was that a part of your psychology that you felt defended the story?
So I read, I'm trying to look up the guy's, the actual name of this title so I get it right, because I think it's really worth reading. So The Madness of, here we go.
I have it.
Extraordinary Popular Delusions and Madness of Crowds.
Yes, 1841.
Yeah, 1841. And I had read this book.
On purpose.
I think the way that happened is that someone had gifted me a Kindle when I was living in the Bahamas and didn't really have any access to bookstores. And I looked up what are the top 100 free Kindle books, that are just past their.
And that was it?
That was one that was on the list.
That's terrifying.
And I started reading it, and it was fascinating because it was much more. The language in it was much more readable than your average, I think, 1840s title. And part of that may have been because it was written in kind of a more populist kind of way, where they're he's trying to catalog all these really strange things that humanity has done at different phases, like everything from the Dutch tulip craze to all the South Seas Company speculation, and this idea that people thought that there would be these gold riches on islands of the Bahamas, for instance, and that these limestone islands would be rich in precious metals, and So I had read that, and that was really fascinating, and it kind of just clicked one day that really what would be an interesting thing to do with this story is to kind of weave the thread, because replacing humans with AI sounds like this very radical departure from justice systems. But if you actually look, if you step through, and the epigraphs you're talking about are granted some of the like craziest, just most batshit insane like legal systems that humans have used in different cultures, for throughout the thousands of years. But if you kind of look at it systematically, what you see is that originally there was this appeal to the supernatural, right? So it would be that we have to do this thing that is left up to what we now would call chance, because that invites like sort of the Almighty to intervene. So
spirits and yeah.
So like the plowshares, right? You heat up these plowshares and you lay them out, and then you blindfold the person and you make them step across, and that's like the trial by fire. They have to walk barefoot across these, and if they step on one, they're guilty, and if they don't, they're not. And what ends up happening is that the clergy in any one of these little small villages, they know the people well. So if somebody's accused of something and they know this is generally a good person who probably wouldn't do this, well, guess what? They're the ones who are actually controlling the spacing of the plowshares. They're the ones who are guiding the blindfolded, woman up so she can take her steps. Yeah. So they have some idea of her stride, and they can kind of put things in her favor in a way that someone watching would not necessarily be aware of. And then later on, that got replaced with, sort of appeals to the king, where you'd have the king or a chief or somebody who was making the decision. And, that was eventually replaced by a jury of your peers, and, all the crazy manipulations that we have in current juries. And, I've worked as an expert witness. I've been in cases where jurors have fallen asleep. And that's a thing that happens.
No, it happens? Like it's happened more than once?
Yes. I mean, I work on patent cases, so they're not typically totally more complicated and boring, especially if you've taken everybody who has any technological like understanding and thrown them off. So it's all just kind of jargon and gobbledygook. It's boring. Wow. So then okay, so we replaced that with AI, and ultimately, like all the other systems, it's not a perfect system. And then the question becomes, okay, if it's an AI system, like whose thumb is on the scale in this iteration of human justice systems?
So what you just said is so interesting to me. So like, I feel like sometimes, so for everyone who's watching, there's Rainville, who's like the main character who all the bad things happen to. And then there's his attorney, Foxwright. And I felt sometimes they were like two sides of the same coin. Like, I don't even know how to explain that, but like, two sides of the same character, like at different times they're anchoring the story. But what you just described is sort of like exactly what happens, is that Foxwright is the guy who's like studying it and looking into it and trying to figure out why it's broken. And he's seeing all these alarming signs that somebody's like a bad actor is playing from the side. And who is the bad actor, right? And we know because we've read the book and you've written it, but like, that's right. It is you start seeing all these red flags of things that don't make sense, because AI is supposed to be so straightforward and simple and easy and obvious. And it's not that way at all.
Yeah, the Foxwright character, he's sort of a crotchety old bastard, right? So like he's cynical.
A likable crotchety old bastard. Eventually. Okay, not at the beginning.
So he is stubborn and he's cynical. But he's cynical in the way that a veteran attorney gets. He's at the same time, he has some level of stubborn buy-in to the system, right? Because you couldn't continue to be an attorney in the system unless you believed that generally it was, possible to get good outcomes and to help your clients, for instance. And so he has sort of his own reckoning of how could the system possibly have been this sort of arbitrarily unfair in this particular case. And that kind of plants this bug of insanity where like he has, regardless of helping his client, he needs to resolve this for his own sanity and figure it out. So that's kind of what drives him. And then he ends up meeting Remla, who, she's much more kind of I don't know. She has kind of more mental plasticity from being more tied into technology and changes and all these types of things. So she helps him see the light in a lot of ways, and kind of brings him around so that he can kind of more competently address the issue.
Maybe she's the one that makes him likable. I don't know. I liked him at the end. By the end, you like him.
You know, I think that's true of most crotchety people. Is when you first meet them, you don't necessarily like them.
Yeah.
And you know, a lot of people, the reason they are crotchety and kind of curmudgeonly is that they have something to offer. Like, you know, they have some lesson, or they're a specialist in whatever field they're in, and people are willing to put up with a lot if, you know, this person is helping with their career by teaching them things that they wouldn't learn any other way. And, you know, eventually you come to the point where you're just like, okay, I got it. I'm not having lunch with you today because you're just way too much. But, you know, I think that's, you know, a sort of a common type of archetype of characters that we encounter every day.
So Rainville, one of the, I read an interview with Nicholas Yarns. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He did an interview with you where you talked about the original Rainville was called Screw and had a multi-tool. And it was sort of interesting to me because I'm like, well, he meets somebody who is like that, who has a multi-tool. Like, it's sort of like, I don't know. I wondered a little bit about the origin of Rainville and like how you got him to where he was. And then how did Vienna come out of that? Because she almost seemed like part of the original Rainville is her.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, originally I had this idea of a character who, like I said, would just be, you know, stealing screws. That was why he was called Screw. He would just be stealing screws out of everything from like the subway car he was on to, you know, like the futuristic equivalent of payphones, you know, taking those apart. Just a person who kind of goes through society and kind of leaves this streak of minor.
Yeah.
What's that?
He's like tapping his little, through the world.
Exactly. And that was an interesting start to the character. And that's, you know, why he ended up participating in like flash mob robberies of stores and things. But over time, he kind of evolved and needed to have some sort of something driving him that wasn't purely just mischief.
Chaos, yeah.
Yeah, and that's he sort of kind of evolved. And at the time I first was writing this, and in fact his name came from when I was working heavily on this, I was reading Bleak House by Dickens.
Oh, wow.
And that really got me into sort of Victorian names, and I've kind of never really gotten away from Victorian, almost kind of single word names. So Rainville and all these different people, like I always admired Dickens' ability to take like a sort of a single word for their last name and have it be something that kind of describes them. The reason I liked Rainville is because it was sort of inscrutable. Like, you know, it wasn't like, you know, Miss Summers and, you know, someone who's all sunshiny, and that's like fairly obvious. It was kind of a little bit more of an inscrutable name from Victorian times.
Yeah. Fun fact: I played Oliver and Oliver Twist in high school. So yeah,
Wow.
I love.
Is that where you got your taste for gruel?
What?
Is that where you got your taste for gruel?
For gruel? Yes, that's it. You know, I've been a fan all these years.
Yeah.
No, but like, I love finding parallels in life. I don't know if you've read Rabbits by Terry Miles. You probably have. That seems like a book you would read.
I have not. No.
Okay, there you go. Book rec for me.
Rabbits, but I have not read Rabbits.
It started with a podcast, but it's all about connections in the world and how maybe there's something behind it versus just it being human nature to find connections. Right. But yeah, I love that. So you just mentioned Dickens, and I'm like, oh, well, I played Oliver. Okay, so moving on. Sorry, not about me. Arcadia. I really wanted like a prequel to know how we got there. So like dome cities and sci-fi are not like kind of like a new thing, right? Like people kind of put, you know, the Earth is, we're destroying the planet and we have to go live under a dome. And it's funny because before I knew about your book, I had a memory of a book that I read when I was in elementary school. And I went on a search to find the book, and I did find it. It's like right here. See, but there's a dome. Do you see the dome?
Yes. That's amazing.
So this is by
cover, and I could have saved a whole lot of time.
Well, this is by Andre Norton, who, by the way, is Alice. She's no longer living, but she's actually a female author. But like, the reason we're under the dome, right? So like in this book, it's weather and we've destroyed the planet. But like in your book, there are things outside of the dome and the world seems fine. So like I was like, well, why are we in a dome? Like what's going on? Like what happened? And maybe you haven't fleshed out the whole prequel, but I was like dying to know the history of how we got there. And then, you know, we talk about the retro mall and the layers of the tunnels under it, and we're walking through a subway or a train. And I was like, but why? So I don't know if you flushed that out, but it's really of interest to me because I love world building. Like, how did you get to that place?
Right. So the city itself is really old. I mean, it's been around for centuries and centuries and centuries. And I think the dome is sort of, I think from a symbology standpoint, it's kind of this isolation between the humans and the story and nature. And so this external chaos that they're all trying to control through technology, it's kind of a representation of that. You know, in more concrete terms, it's probably the sense that, you know, like living further south, we all just take for granted air conditioning, right? There's entire cities in the United States, for instance, like Phoenix, where the only reason Phoenix was ever settled was because it used to be the intersection of these two rivers that weren't sort of pumped dry, and it lowered the temperature by like 15 degrees. And now, you know, Phoenix probably would not exist if not for air conditioning. Right. So, you know, I think that climate control and weather control is something that will be appealing at, you know, some point in the future, especially if you have this concept of biomes where you can have domes within domes. And, you know, I think where you kind of see that is like in New York City, you go into Central Park, and if you're on the Upper East Side or the Upper West Side, it's this drastic departure from anything in any direction.
Right.
And it's, you know, it's one of the most, I would argue, probably the most amazing park, large scale park in the world. And so, and you know, Vaux Park is actually named after one of the designers of, you know, between Vaux and Olmsted. So there's that aspect of it, and there's different biomes. You know, there's snowy places and sort of more tropical places, rainforests, things like that, that are sort of these parks that are in their own subdomes. And on top of that, you've got layers of like the Yaodongs are based off of a region of China where people have sort of carved their houses into slot canyons. The necropolis outside, that is sort of based off of like what happened with San Francisco, and they kind of like greedy politicians back in the day, developers gave them a bunch of money to decide that cemeteries were unsanitary. And so we had to clear out all the cemeteries out of San Francisco and put them somewhere else. And this is why you go to a place like New York City and you'll see these little graveyards tucked here and there. And same with Baltimore. You know, where Edgar Allan Poe is buried is a really fascinating little cemetery that's been sort of built up.
Yeah, but those are everywhere. Those little cemeteries, like around the corner from someone's house and in someone's front yard.
But not in San Francisco. There's absolutely nothing like that. And it's because they sold the land to developers. They excavated and moved the occupants to other places, but they didn't do a perfect job. They never do when it comes to old cemeteries. And in California, there's this place called Colma, Colma, and it's a city of the dead. It has something like, I don't know, I think it's like 100,000 residents of, you know, deceased people, and the deceased population drastically outnumbers the living population. And then layered into that is kind of like Cairo's City of the Dead, which is a slum where there are, it's not incredibly mainstream, but there are a certain number of people in that slum who live in old mausoleums. So that's what kind of inspired the.
Yeah, that was horrible. That whole section was really hard. Like,
yeah, it's fascinating because the actual imagery in that cemetery is based on a private cemetery in Belgium, where kind of everybody there has been there for enough hundreds of years that there's no one visiting it anymore. So it's just kind of this haunted ruin that still has little pictures of all the people and, you know, the suits of their time, and, you know, the little oval shaped ceramic discs they used to put on grave markers at the time. And so it's kind of an amalgamation of all those things, but that's where that aspect of the city came from. And I think those are kind of some of the main influences. I mean, then you add in some futurism with, there's a part of the city that is called the flux that is continually reconfiguring itself. That came from a lecture at Stanford, maybe like 20 years ago, of this architect who was studying, the question in architecture is sort of like, should form follow function or should function follow form? And he had explored this place, I think it was in India, where it was purely form following function. And they had done this study of this village of these sort of clay adobe type structures, and how if people keep cutting this corner short, they tend to brush up against it and it rounds off this corner. And so the question is, if you design a sort of small, city, and you are continually making modifications to optimize for the flow of people and where they're trying to get, it's kind of like if you are on any college campus and you see there's this path through the grass where people have taken a shortcut. Well, what if you pave that and you make that like an official thing now? So it's sort of, that is what the idea of the flux is, where you've got kind of continuous reconfiguration of a place, not just in 2 dimensions, but in 3.
Interesting with the dome, because I think when I think of sci-fi, I think of what I said before, that people move under domes for weather, planet destruction reasons. But yours is actually more in line with the AI. It was more of a convenience isn't the right word, but a demand, a convenience that we have AI computers control more and more of our life because it's easier and nicer, and I don't have to think about it. So it's so different actually than other dome stories, because it's more human nature and what we have allowed to happen. So that way we live happy lives, where we can walk into a room and there's snow, and we walk into another room and there's jungle, and the butterflies and all the things you have, like, they wanted that. And they allowed it to happen because it made their lives better, easier, less difficult.
Yeah, and I think that there's a parallel metaphor with our current justice system in the United States, which is that we've got all these judges that we know nothing about, right? If you're running for any sort of legislative role, there's been a lot of due diligence done on you, unless you're that guy from New York who just lied about everything and got in. But if you're not that guy, like, generally speaking, you're pretty well vetted. And we are in this really strange kind of political marketplace where you walk in and you get your ballot, and there's all these judges listed. And it'll say, do you want to retain this person, or like give them their pink slip and send them walking? And none of the names are people you've ever seen before. And first of all, there's this really damaging trend where people will just say retain for anyone they haven't heard of, all the way down. So no matter how bad a judge is, they'll generally get retained. The only time that ever doesn't happen is when the bar association in that state is like, we really urge you not to put this person back in. They're drunk every trial, and the problem is the only time the bar associations do that is if they're 100% sure they're going to be successful. Because
I've never seen that.
Yeah, it's happened in Colorado a few times. If they issue a recommendation, they're like, you need to get rid of this person. They'll only do it if they're certain it's going to work. Because if it doesn't work, guess what? All the people in leadership associations with that bar association are now still having to appear before that judge, and none of their clients are ever going to get a fair shake again. Right. So, and then meanwhile, you as the voter, even if you want to research these judges, it's really not accessible. Like, you'll try to search for decisions by a certain judge, and it'll want you to sign up for some sort of a commercial service to like read case law. Most states don't have a mechanism for rating judges and saying, these are what this particular judge believes in. These are the things the decisions she's done. Maybe these are some of the more controversial ones. There's no way to do that. And then meanwhile, we have people just checking boxes because they're there. And it's because it's easier, right? It's really easy to think that the justice system is doing a good job and not convicting innocent people and condemning them to decades in prison for things they didn't do. It's easy to just assume the poor people who can't afford good representation get a fair shake. And then the first time, in your life that you have any kind of contact with that, even if you didn't go to law school and have to go to a lot of like cases as part of that, you suddenly start realizing, wow, there's like this really imperfect topology and topography of like, fairness. And I think the justice system is a great example of something where people have just kind of, it's very easy to out of sight, out of mind. We put people in
assume
charge
it's working
of that.
the way it was designed to work.
Yeah, it's run by specialists. Like, what could possibly go wrong?
Right. Like, I'm going to go out to lunch today and I'm going to do this and that. Like, I'm sure it's fine. I'm just not even going to think about it. But it's so interesting that you brought up the judges, because literally for me, and I'm admitting this publicly, so sorry, I stop at that section and I'm like, damn, like, I don't know who these people like. And I used to be like, I would vote maybe for the party that I'm in, like if it was labeled like, oh, okay. Mm-hmm. But now I've stopped because I'm like, I'm literally giving my vote to someone who could be completely incompetent or a bad guy, and I shouldn't vote for something I don't know. So in my youth, I think I would vote for whoever was like in the party that I'm in. Now I've stopped and I skip it because
I did that too. And it was one of these things where like, and it's insane to me that I did that for multiple elections, because it's like, if I literally haven't heard your name until I saw it on like, I've never even heard your name until it's on this ballot. And I'm like, oh yeah, let's this guy looks great. Like that's insane.
It's awful.
Completely insane.
I'm too old to do it now, though. I'm glad you admitted it with me, though, so I don't feel so alone and ashamed of myself. Like, we can share.
Yeah, I mean, this is like part of a larger issue, right? With like, rock the vote. Like, let's go get people who are not even remotely politically engaged, and get them to run out and cast a vote so they can feel like they did their part. And it's like, no, like if you don't feel engaged enough that you have an opinion, like you don't need to be marching down to a polling place and like
and voting just because I drove you there or whatnot.
I would rather like 40% or 30% of people vote who actually follow the news than people who just kind of need to be awakened from a stupor and march down to a polling
But that's
place.
the difference, right? And that plays into the story because we have so many people who aren't paying attention.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what that percentage is, if it's like, 20 or 50 or 70. But like, it's big, right? Some people, and then there are the rest of us, who maybe are paying attention, but we're like, I'm going to vote, but it may not help.
Well, and justice is a really hard problem, right? So I think it's something that it's very appealing for humanity to just like relegate to someone else to take care of and think that it's being taken care of. It's, it requires specialized knowledge, which makes it difficult. It's kind of like tax law, right?
I don't know anything about tax law, so you tell me.
Tax law is there's literally like thousands and thousands and thousands of pages in the Internal Revenue Code. So let's say you're in Congress and even presume that you're trying to do the right thing as a legislator. You can't possibly, if you have any sort of a day job or any other commitments, you can't possibly understand the tax code and how it evolves from year to year. So they're reliant on these people who understand the tax code to come in and give, testimony before Congress about how we should change this and this. And inevitably, they have to rely on, the K Street lobby, who are all the tax attorneys in DC, who get paid. They get paid more when there's changes every year. So they want to kind of constantly rock the boat a little bit. So their clients have to keep, all right, what's the picture this year, Bob? Like, what do we have to, how do we have to change my strategy? But never are they going to vote for something that simplifies and makes those 7,000 pages go away, like like a VAT tax or something like that, where it's just flat and everybody understands it, or like the fair tax. They're never going to support that. So it creates this difficult situation where this is a specialized enough thing that it's difficult for us to do ourselves. And so, kind of like with the Ashanti legal system that I talked about in one of the like epitaphs, it's you let these kind of specialists run off and do their own crazy thing that is not necessarily what the people in the village would ever have chosen to do.
No, but I mean, it's so complicated now that we have to rely on other people to dissect it for us. And then that means that we don't have the visibility or knowledge to break it down to see if it's even working. Right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. And when you add AI into it, it's like, it's even more daunting, because now it's like AIs are a very convenient and appealing way to kind of rein in all this complexity and make it be understood.
But it's not. I mean, it was the interview you did for the podcast, but you guys were talking about, I think it was Google, like created two AIs and they were talking to each other and they made their own language. And then like they had to shut it down because they were like, we don't even know where it's going. Like they are inventing their own things and their own rules and their own guidelines to something we haven't outlined.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the fascinating things about AIs that have not they're just sort of beginning to be tapped into now, is this idea of, what makes humanity a much, give humanity a much greater potential than, say, squirrels, is that we have this whole, it's not a collective unconscious, but we have this way of just communicating with each other. And even though we're individualistic, we have the same kind of level of communication that like bees have, where we can kind of
hive mind. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a hive mind, but it's also individualistic and kind of competitive. So it's a little better. I think there's less like senseless sacrifice than you get with bees in humanity, but it lets us, connect in a way that a lot of other species can't, like at a global level. And not only at a global level, but like, you can write a book, like you guys were talking about Watership Down like a couple episodes ago.
So good.
And that's an example of somebody who's like not even alive now, and yet can still be imparting these like really meaningful messages generations later. And that is like this massive force multiplier that humanity has that other species don't necessarily have the advantage of. And so what if we like look at AIs like that? Like you've got these AIs, they're individualistic. So they're not like bees, right? Bees are very genetically similar from one bee to the next. They're almost identical. So they're all like kind of like twins. Humans are not like that. AIs don't need to be like that. Like you can train AIs. Like if you're going to do jurors, you don't just want multiple agents that are identical to each other and are going to cuckoo the same thing. You want one that's more attuned to this value and one that's more attuned to this value. Kind of like legal ethicists, right?
Yeah.
You would want them to have like a really healthy debate before they decided something. So that I think is really interesting when you look at what if AIs could communicate? What if they communicate secretly? What if they're form a terrorist organization and each group of AIs is its own little cell that only knows a certain amount about the other things? Like there's no reason all these things couldn't happen. And it's kind of fascinating to look at what the inevitable result would be and how you keep this from happening.
Well, and the book explores that, right? Because, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but the thing about this book too, I feel like, and I'm not going to, if you gave away the ending, you'd still want to read it because it's not just about the ending, right? It's about the pathway to find the solution. Like that's really, to me, like more than the climax of the story at the end. It's how you sit back at the end of it and interpret it. That's the story, and the outcome. But you have that too, because you have a couple of AI, I don't know how to say this without too many spoilers, AI machines that have different personalities and different objectives on their own, working independently of humans. That's already happening in your story. So like,
Right.
To your point, like if they would have recruited, is that a word that we can use?
Yes.
Recruited other AI personalities to join in whatever they decide their purpose is supposed to be for whatever grand reason they're going for. That's exactly how this book could have ended out. But, in your book, they were sort of independent and they enjoyed or appreciated their independence. But that could just shift into this, again, crowd hysteria mentality. What happens when AI gets hysterical?
Yeah, and this is something that I've been working on the sequel, which gets at some of this, which is that you've got all these AIs around, and it's kind of more Wild West of AIs by the time of the sequel, where the limits.
They haven't learned anything in the first.
Well, the humans have attempted to put limits on them, and it turns out those weren't sufficient.
Got it. Okay.
So you end up in these situations where there's like sort of AI gang wars, where AIs are sort of, and I guess the closest human analogy would be like, take a force for good in like, the West Coast in the like late 1800s. You had the Pinkerton Detective Agency that was sort of a privatized police force. But when they went up against a rival, I mean, they were like shootings in the streets and it was like a gang war. And so if you start looking at AIs where they sort of band together and they have gang wars, what does that look like? So
horrible.
Well, I think it's more subtle, right? Like one of the things that you can do with AI is you can try to spike, you can sort of overtrain it in some way and spike the data set that they learn from. The most probably user-friendly version of that's really clear is like when they first came out with autonomous vehicles, there was an artist, I think in California, and his whole deal was he would try to paint strange patterns of lines on the road to confuse autonomous vehicles. And it turned out if you put this solid white line and you spiraled it inward, that the car would just think that, you know, the curving white line was something that could not be violated, and it would just keep going in until it just stopped, and it had no idea where to go. And the question is, like, with AI, you know, the way you hack an AI, if you can't get direct access to it, is you keep bombarding it with this case that you want it to act a certain way for. And it inserts sort of a backdoor in its behavior. And if you go back later and you create that situation, well, now it's going to do this weird thing that doesn't really correspond to what it would have done in some adjacent case. And it's kind of like adding a backdoor to how it works. And as a programmer, it's very difficult to detect that. So that is presumably how AIs are going to mess with each other. They're going to try to find ways to disable safety protocols, try to find ways to get incorrect outcomes, or you know, tap into things that could potentially let you sort of reprogram the AI and not just use it.
Have you read Snow Crash? I forget who wrote it. It's like it
has
like some Snow Crash vibes. Like,
you know, that was when we started our writing program back in like 2012. We had to analyze a novel and take it apart. And I actually picked Snow Crash because it was so fast moving, and it just had such a great vibe to it that's when I was writing the early scenes and the flash mob robbery and stuff. I was absolutely trying to channel that like fast paced energy.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah.
I think one of the things that Neil Stephenson did with that novel is that he used really short chapters, so it felt like you were just kind of flying through the book as you're reading, which I also tried to leverage in my own work.
I almost want to like reread it again because it's been a bit, and then like talk to you again so we can take your analysis of it and I can like infuse it into.
Yeah, I would totally be willing to do that. It'd be fun to go back and check my notes because we had to do this really in-depth analysis of like chapter to chapter to chapter. And
I want to do it with rabbits too. You have to let me know when you read rabbits, because there's a sequel and I haven't read the sequel yet.
What's the sequel called?
The Quiet Room.
Okay, so less rabbit related.
Yeah, my TBR list is sort of out of control right now, so I have to I'm like, well, maybe then I'll go read, and then I'll read, and then I'll read. So it's all over the place. I don't know what yours would possibly be, your TBR list.
You know, I have this giant, I don't know. Once you get into these sort of writing peer groups, you always have this giant stack of books where you are obligated to read this book and write a review for it and read this one. So you lose a lot of autonomy when it comes to reading, and it's I don't know. I haven't seen the bottom of my inbox of books to read in a very
long time. But you should. I hope that in that role though you get to abstain. You know what I mean? Like, this really isn't something that I'm going to enjoy. So like, I support you and you're amazing, but like, it's not my jam, and I don't want to give you something that's unfairly.
I'm bad at abstaining from things like that. So at some point, I don't know. I need, you know what I need is I need a little bit more commercial success, so I get a bigger ego, and then I can kind of start forgetting about the little people. I think is what needs.
Well, I'll help you. In fact, I was in research. I was reading about the epitaphs, that extraordinary popular delusions and madness of crowds. And in the Wikipedia, there's like modern mentions. I forget what they call that category in Wikipedia. And it's like, oh, so-and-so in their book said XYZ. And I'm like, why is Juris not in here? Right? Like, you literally quote it. So we will have to help get you.
That would be great. I would. Yeah. I think it would be nice, because I think that the epitaphs, they span probably at least two other works that are very similar in scope to that. And so I think if you like that particular work, I think you would also like the one from 1954. I think it was Hubble was the or Hobel was the I don't know, legal anthropology.
Arab Legion, 1956.
No, I believe that's from a biography.
Oh, okay.
I'm thinking of the one that was more about like just a straight up legal anthropology text. And legal anthropology, like, if you had asked me up until I was writing this book if that's an interesting topic, I would have said, no, that sounds incredibly dry. But it's fascinating. Like, the idea that you had the Ashanti building these like totems to summon more litigation so that there could be more trials and like all the specialists could make more money. Like, that sounds insane. And yet it's totally what we have now. Like, you have that as soon as you cross the line into Georgia and you've just got nothing but billboards for attorneys. Like, that's very similar to the Ashanti. So it's fascinating to see the parallels between what people kind of chuckled at in 1954 and what has completely come back around like full circle now.
Well, what was fun about that, and then I'll get to my review because we're coming up on an hour and I don't want to take your whole day, although it sounds like we could.
Yep.
Is that in you have all these quotes from all of these books that talk about human behavior and kind of how we got here in human psychology. But then like you use Fox, right, who's one of your main characters, excerpts from his writings to bring us up to speed, right? So then there's excerpts from 1800s books that are witch trials and how we figure out if someone's lying or not, and then human nature and how we all convince each other that we're on the right path. And then it's like almost like there's a gap because this book takes place in the future. We needed someone to fill in the gaps on history that hasn't happened yet. And those were Fox Wright's writings. So it also gave us this glimpse into the character and defense of how we got to where we are.
Yeah, and it shows this sort of like thematic arc in his understanding that he starts out being someone who's completely bought into this system, and he's just trying to explain it to the people who are too ignorant to understand why you would do that. And then in the end, we get that same chapter rewritten, and it's more from the standpoint of the system failed us, and now we have to analyze which ways it failed us that were avoidable and which ways maybe weren't. So that's
by book 2, have they fixed it, or is this just another problem related to AI?
Book 2 is less about the justice system. So I think I wouldn't say it's something where they've specifically fixed it. I think these are fixable things. I think the second story is much more kind of societal and I don't know, maybe almost like more like Westworld when everything starts to break down, if you saw that show, and things are more kind of free form in the real world. So it's not going to be about the justice system. It's going to have another Latin, poorly conjugated Latin title that's is still
I
about
can't pronounce. Thank you for that.
The machina part, but maybe less about the juris part.
That's good. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and bring my review out here. I haven't shared it with you yet, but I just want to read it to you. I'm calling it sci-fi fantasy, so I don't know if that bothers you or not, but
yeah.
Sci-fi fantasy at its best. It's set in a futuristic society where humans rely on machines for damn near everything, including justice. JURIS explores man's dedication, reliance, and potential destruction at the hands of artificial intelligence. John Maly weaves his knowledge of computer science and law into fascinating, thrilling, and sometimes terrifying story of what could be. Highly recommended for those who love science fiction, dystopian fiction, one of my favorites, and or dark fantasy. JURIS is brilliantly written, very creative, and sometimes frightening. A must read.
I think that has to go in the back cover of the second edition.
Oh, thanks. That's so sweet. That's so sweet. So we know a sequel's coming up. I read that you were also working on a fantasy novel about.
I am. It's a fantasy novel. It's. I think. Whenever I write anything, it's always sort of fascinating to like the thing that keeps pulling me back is like, strangely, is bioethics. Like I find it really interesting to study human psychology and how it changes in sort of strange corner cases of humanity, and whether that's because humans are immortal, or it's because magic exists. And this particular novel, the premise is that magic exists, but it's not like Lord of the Rings or like Star Wars, where you just suck energy out of the space around you that's just a free resource. In actuality, what you're doing is that energy has to come from somewhere. So whether you're killing all the plants around you or whether you're doing something even worse, it kind of explores how do you responsibly use magic and channel energy from one place to another without there being lots of unintended consequences. And that, I suppose, is a theme that's common between JURIS Ex Machina and the fantasy novel that's under development. It's also about like unintended consequences and how it's easy to just abstract those away and can be really damaging if you do.
Well, I'm pretending that they're not happening. Yeah. which is so easy for us because we have very short, limited lives, right? I always say life is short. Like we're parents, we know that life is so short. As long
Yeah.
as it feels, some days it's short.
And our attention spans are even shorter. So
Right. And so, when you think of what's going to happen to a future generation, you're like, oh, that's really sad, but I won't be here. Like, so it's easy to be very selfish, right? It's easy to turn the other way and ignore because we have this very limited time, here. I'm going to end this. Jay Sanchez, he says he's Ed Sanchez's cousin in Virginia. Does that mean something to you?
yeah. Hi,
He says it was a
cousin.
fantastic read, page turner, Hollywood ending, got me back into reading. I've inhaled 2 sci-fi books since and looking forward to your next novel.
Thanks, Ed's cousin. I think that's a great and very accurate review.
No, but it's great because isn't the whole joy of getting people back into reading? Like reading is such a joy. And thank you for your contribution to it. I look forward to reading more. I look forward to seeing the map in the book because I still have my Kindle, so I need to get the book and
There is a map.
and read the map. And John,
Yeah.
thank you so much. For those who have joined us today, we were here with John Maly and his book, Juris Ex Machina.
That's right.
Okay, thank you. I worry. It is a fantastic read. Pick it up if you love sci-fi, dystopian, technology, law. This one's for you. So thank you, John. I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks for having me on. It was great.
All right. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.